Oil is like a wild animal. It will always escape if it finds an opening despite all the geopolitical tensions that we have around the world. We are expecting a surplus in the market. There is more supply than demand. If they were to put more barrels in the market more aggressively, prices will collapse. They're all fighting for the same share of the pipe. It will be the battle of the fittest. Is the global oil industry heading for a boom or a bust? That's the question I want to explore with John Wick, founder and CEO of Crystal Energy, who spent her career analyzing the complexities of global energy markets. John, thanks so much for being with us today. Now, we're hearing a lot of talk right now about a potential over-up of oil in the market. What does that mean for the average consumer?
Well, definitely. The consensus today among most analysts and market observers except OPEC, or OPEC Plus. And so the concept says is that we are expecting a surplus in the market, which means that there is more supply than demand. Now, we have to be careful. It does not mean that demand is not growing. It just simply means that the supply is growing faster than the demand. And this is where we talk about surplus. Now, typically in any market conditions, when you have additional supplies coming to the market and not enough demand to absorb those additional barrels, then definitely you end up having downward pressure on prices. And actually, if you look at where oil prices are, take Brent for instance, you can see that despite all the geopolitical tensions that we have around the world, but particularly in Europe with the war in Ukraine and sanctions on Russia, sanctions on Iran, sanctions on Venezuela, and instability in other places. So despite all this geopolitical cocktail that we have outside terms of crisis and stability, prices are still where they are today, around 60 or mid-60s, and that is by historical standards. At least in the last few years, I can say it's relatively low. It's not necessarily low for consumers who would like to see much lower prices, but it is compared to what we saw before a low price given the existing condition. That by itself tells me there is more supply in the market than demand.
You mentioned that the consensus does not include OPEC Plus, and we have had some mixed messaging. So, OPEC Plus says it will slightly increase production in December, but it scrapped its original plans to do the same in the first quarter of next year. Can you help us understand that decision?
Indeed. So first of all, we have to understand that OPEC Plus has introduced over the last few years 3 layers of cuts. 2 of them were voluntary, whereby some members, 7 to 8 members of OPEC Plus, decided to remove more barrels in the market. And also there is the group as a whole, introduced also some cuts. Now those cuts were there for some time, and of course when you reduce your production, you're losing market share, and you're maybe making less revenue, especially when prices are low. So what the members, those who introduced the voluntary cuts, and there were 2 layers of voluntary cuts, started to unwind those barrels back in the market. What we saw is that the first tranche of those cuts were brought in the market quite rapidly within a few months, instead of being stretched over a longer period. So we saw an acceleration of bringing those barrels back in the market, especially over the summer period. But when we hit September, we saw that when they wanted to introduce a second tranche of voluntary cuts being released, we saw a very different attitude. We saw a more cautious attitude, and the release was much slower, and now it has been suspended for next year. So from January, we're not going to see more barrels, at least for the time being. Now this tells me 2 things. First of all, of course, it's a reflection of market realities that usually in the summer during the holiday season, you would see people traveling more, driving more, and that creates additional seasonality in the demand. So there is more demand, and that could explain the more aggressive release of the barrels from OPEC Plus come September and October. That seasonality of the demand diminishes and almost disappears. We're talking about usually 1 million barrels a day is not surprising to disappear in terms of demand growth. So that by itself calls for caution from OPEC. So if they were to put more barrels in the market more aggressively, prices will collapse. So they were more cautious, and the fact that they decided to stop releasing more barrels as of next year for the time being tells me that actually they are concerned about demand growth. So it seems that OPEC Plus, even though they are still sticking to their ambitious numbers for demand growth, which are double than what, for example, the International Energy Agency is forecasting, they are now thinking more cautiously about potential growth for demand. And what does it mean if they put more barrels in the market? So there is concern about further collapse in prices.
That's all really interesting. So seasonal factors on one hand and general global demand potentially falling. I want to talk about the sanctions you mentioned as well. So the US putting sanctions on two of Russia's biggest oil companies and the banks that do business with them last month. If we consider that Russia is the world's third largest producer after the US and Saudi, what tangible effect, if any, is this likely to have on global supply?
Look, let's be, very clear here and transparent and honest with ourselves. Sanctions are not something that would have an immediate effect. They create fear in the market and concerns. But as we have seen, they take time to have more tangible, desirable effects. And that's what we can see. So you can see, for example, Russian oil is still being traded in the market. You close one door, that it finds another opening from another window, and it gets into the market. There's actually a very beautiful law case from the 1800s in the US, which made it very clear that oil is like a wild animal. It will always escape it if it finds an opening, and that kind of statement is still valid today. And that's what we have. We have a big global market, whereby you can easily manipulate it to get around sanctions. So that is the first thing, that we're not seeing the barrels from Russia disappearing or not finding buyers. But of course, it's not easy to trade Russian oil. I mean, you'll have to use dark fleet. You have to go into all sorts of transactions, opaque transactions. You have the headache of insurance, which is not there. And most importantly, you're also selling the oil at a discount. So yes, there are revenues generated still coming to the Russian coffers, but it's not at the same level. Now, when you target with these new sanctions, the main buyers of Russian oil, primarily China and India, and especially India, because China was always like a large buyer of Russian oil. Maybe it increased a little bit, taking advantage of the discounted price, but India jumped from almost nothing to really just being behind China in a very short period of time. So if you target sanctions or at least punitive tariffs on those countries, in theory, because they are buying Russian oil, then they might feel that whatever economic advantage they are getting from buying that discounted oil from Russia is not big enough to compensate for the economic pain that those tariffs are causing on our country. So you have to weigh the pros and cons of each measure, and this is what is hoped for. Now, it seems that India might give in, and they are still buying Russian oil. They will reduce it, but I doubt they are going to stop buying Russian oil altogether. And at the end, we have to be realistic here. We cannot chase the molecule of the oil once it leaves the oil field or the production facility and being blended in a refinery with other molecules. So what maybe was pure Russian oil end up being Russian oil plus something else, and it end up going to the market which did not want that Russian oil. So it's not clear cut, unfortunately, when it comes to sanctions, but they do cause economic pain. They do cause difficulties, but it's unlikely that they are the only tool that will cause significant pain to Russia to force it to stop the war on Ukraine.
Right. As you say, oil is a wild animal. It will always find its way. If we look at the longer-term picture now, it's a great picture. The oil industry generally is in a period of transformation. Some parts of the world, like China, are seeing a decline in demand as EVs and renewables take off. But in other parts of the world, you mentioned India and even in the US, demand for oil is continuing to rise. What do these diverging trends mean for the industry as a whole?
There is no doubt demand for oil is still growing. So we have not hit what people believe is the peak oil demand, where you climbing Mount Everest and you hit the top. Yeah, that's the peak when we talk about oil demand. So it is still growing. And the hitting the peak is something that people think that might happen by the end of this decade, by the middle of the next decade, Really, nobody knows when that will happen. But guess what? In the developed economies, oil demand peaked already around 2005 or 2006. Now, there are two things I'd like to distinguish here. First of all, demand for oil is growing, but is not growing at the same speed as before. And that kind of speed. So imagine yourself, you're driving a car, and you first grow very fast, and then you start slowing down. So you're still driving, but the speed with which you are driving is not the same. And that has already implications on a market where supply is still growing, and there are lots of producers around, and there's no shortage of oil supply. So that translates into weaker prices, as we are seeing today. But even, for example, when you hit the peak, you can stay in that peak for a long time, or you can start declining gradually, but still all that does not going to change the picture dramatically, but it has important implications for producers in terms of competition. So when many producers are competing for a market which is not really growing rapidly, then they have to think of how to reduce cost, how to be more efficient, how to maintain a strong position in the market, because they are all fighting for the same share of the pie. And this is why, when we think about the industry in the future, in the long term, not just a year or two, but really talking about 20, 30 years down the line, I think what we are seeing today, when you hear industry representatives and executives, they would always talk about efficiency gains. They always talk about reducing carbon footprint. So even if you think today that maybe the energy transition is decelerating, companies are not ditching their, for example, objective of reducing their carbon footprint, because they know that in the very long term, if they are to remain competitive in this world where demand, yes, may be still growing in some parts, but in other parts of the world is not growing as fast. They know that in that world it will be the battle of the fittest, and the fittest is the producer with the lowest cost of production and the lowest carbon intensity. So it is this kind of competitive dynamics that we have to be aware of when we're thinking about demand growth and demand peak, among others, and not to treat all oil producers in the same way, whether we're talking about countries or we're talking about companies.
That's also interesting, and I really want to talk about Saudi Arabia in this particular context because it's expected to account for the single largest decline in oil demand of any country by 2030. That's according to the IAE. I think this will seem surprising or counterintuitive to a lot of people who see the country pretty much as synonymous with oil still. What is going on there? What is Saudi Arabia perhaps doing, right?
Look, Saudi Arabia is very rich in oil, right? Not just in terms of production, but they have massive reserves and they have some of the lowest cost of production in the world. So it does make sense to see them using their own resources domestically. Now, the problem becomes when oil is so cheap, just like any other commodity, then you don't think too much about being efficient. So you start wasting it. And that's why Saudi Arabia, for example, is still one of the few countries in the world. And actually the Middle East as a whole is probably the main region and the only region in the world that uses so much oil in power generation. And that is by itself a loss or a waste of an important resource. Because instead of burning it in power to generate electricity, especially in the summer, to keep your houses cool, you could have used that resource and then sell it to the international market and make more money out of it. So there is definitely a logical, rational argument behind that. So if Saudi Arabia, for example, and that's what they are trying to do today, are using more natural gas, and even also investing in green energy to generate electricity domestically, they will free up a lot of oil from domestic market that where it's being burnt, wasted, and then sold abroad. And also there is additional advantage that will reduce the country's carbon footprint. It's amazing what you can do in terms of carbon emissions when you switch from burning oil in power generation than even to burning gas, because gas has much lower carbon dioxide emissions per kilowatt hour than oil. So this is a kind of logic that we are seeing, but there's also another aspect that we have not really touched on, is improvements in energy efficiency. The way we consume oil, it's I mean, Jen, globally, you can see everywhere in the world except in the Middle East that there has been significant improvements in energy efficiency, which is like you see that the amount of energy or oil used to produce, let's say, 1 unit of GDP is much less today than it was maybe in the 70s in the Middle East. It remains high and higher than the rest of the world. So they are also working on that aspect to reduce and the waste of energy, to reduce energy intensity. And that by itself translates into a slower demand growth for oil and for energy in general.
That makes sense. Now, Carl, you're currently in Abu Dhabi attending this major oil summit. One comment that stood out to me came from the Qatari energy minister who threatened to stop selling LG liquefied natural gas to Europe unless it either waters down or scraps its environmental regulation known as CSD. Not the catiest. But how serious is that threat?
I mean, look, you have to understand where the Qataris are coming from, is that you have to put yourself in their shoes. You have a market that is asking for your gas, especially that market lost or wants to completely free itself from another supplier, that is Russia, and is turning to other suppliers, say, we want your gas. But hold on a minute, we want your gas only if you do A, B, C, D. But then you have that same producer has other opportunities elsewhere, such as in Asia and the Chinese, for instance, or elsewhere, where demand for gas is quite strong and has a fantastic future because of the switch from coal to gas in power generation. They are saying, you know what, we really want your gas. So put yourself in the Qatari shoes and they say, okay, so between these two markets, we're not charity, we want to make money. Yes, we want to diversify our markets. Europe is an okay market for us, but it's not really booming. It's not strong market. It doesn't have really in the future. For gas is not secured because of all the climate policies and sometimes the controversies surrounding fossil fuel. So I can turn to my other buyer, Asia. Now that's how they are thinking. And when they come and they make this kind of test, but you know, you have to be careful. They are not threatening because Qatar so far has been a very reliable supplier when it comes to LG exports. So if they are going to start threatening in ad hoc way, they will use that very important image that they took time to build over the years. So we have to be careful in terms of interpreting their statement. But I think what they were trying to say is that they do have opportunities to sell their gas. There is enough demand for their gas and they can choose where to sell it for. And then so it would be like a fair kind of negotiation between what the market wants and what the producer wants.
Yeah, I understand what you're saying, that Europe doesn't really hold the cards here. But I'm wondering, do you think, say, the United States would be more likely to adhere to these climate regulations? Or do you think Europe really has little choice but to reduce them at the very least?
Well, what has the US been calling for, especially under President Trump's administration? They have been criticizing the methane emissions rules in the EU. So I don't think the US is in a different camp than, for example, Qatar when it comes to not expressing their discontent with the environmental rules in the EU, in Europe. And, you know, look, if they want to follow those rules, they can, of course, sell their gas to Europe. But after all, American gas will go to whoever pays the highest price. So if China comes and offer a higher price, American gas will go to China and not to Europe.
All right. So many different facets to discuss. John, it's been a pleasure to speak to you again. Thank you so much.